being very helpful for us, and we actually obtained centralized funding for the program. So if any of you have ever tried to implement something very significant architecturally, you know it's very difficult to do that through piecemeal projects, right? So you can't build a whole through a lot of little projects. It's very, very hard. You end up with very complex architecture despite the best of intentions. So we obtained centralized funding not just for the first release, but actually created a portfolio for enterprise data solutions that we hope will let us continue to build that platform out over time. So then we don't have to worry about specific portfolios prioritizing their individual needs of the moment, right? Because they're always going to look out for themselves and not want to or not have the funding to solve the enterprise problems. The other thing that we did is we actually formed a team that did nothing but ROI for like 8 weeks. And it drove all the technical teams crazy because they didn't want to participate in it. But ended up being incredibly helpful because what that actually provided for us was a framework and benchmarks to measure value. And the specific approach that we took was kind of a before and after. So we did a framework that included all the things we do every day, like data feeds and reports and data quality issue investigations and things like that. And we know exactly how much those things cost because every single one that we do goes through an estimation process. So we know how much it costs and how long it takes. And then we essentially projected those same use cases over the next 5 years using the new platform. And that was how we communicated the value and the actual investment return. TCO is somewhat easy. You know, you can add up all your cost of tools and people, but what was really difficult was actually this part around business value. The other part that was somewhat difficult was to subtract out the things that you're going to get rid of, right? So those costs will go away over time, or perhaps you won't have to do upgrades to some of the tools. And that was a little bit harder because, again, for that, you actually need to have a transitional architecture. So that was also a challenge. Probably seems obvious, but secure senior business sponsorship. So you certainly need sponsorship from across IT and business, but because it's going to be difficult and because you're going to run into situations where you have to make business trade-offs, if you don't have a very strong support system on the business at the most executive level, then it's going to be very difficult to actually make progress. So this is kind of a busy slide, but try to summarize some of the perhaps lessons learned or factors that we thought were important for success. This is not to imply that we did all of these well. Some of these we did well, and some of these we learned that we should have done better along the way. So the first one, start with data governance first. If you don't have a good data governance discipline now, without a big data platform, it's going to be even so much harder when you do have a big data platform. And what do I mean by good data governance practice? First and foremost, you need to have data owners assigned at the most senior levels of organization in the business. So there has to be business owned, accountability has to be on the business side, and it actually has to be at a level high enough to make decisions. A lot of times what we do is we work with data stewards and owners at kind of that middle tier, and they're only accustomed to seeing the world from their perspective. So it's very difficult for them to actually make the harder decisions from an enterprise perspective. So you need senior leadership there. If you don't have a business glossary with definitions, it's something that you're going to need. And you need processes for actually making decisions and trade-offs. So ultimately what's going to happen is someone's going to want to do something that doesn't quite align with your data architecture or with the specific data policy. And you have to put a framework in place ahead of time as to how to weigh those pros and cons, because in the heat of the moment, in that situation, if you don't have a formal process for weighing that, then whomever speaks the loudest or has the most political influence is going to win. So you have to do it early and get it ratified ahead of time. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult. We actually started the data governance process about 6 months before we bought a single tool or even finished the architecture. So we started out very early on, forming a brand new framework, brand new mechanisms, owners, roles, processes, all the boring stuff. It was an individual track of work in the program that had nothing to do with technology that we started off with first. The second one, so we chose very consciously not to focus on 1 or 2 use cases. We chose consciously to focus on the foundation underneath and enabling a few use cases on top at the same time. So our goals were adaptability, flexibility, something that can scale and grow with the business over time, as opposed to a very individual need. So this becomes somewhat difficult if you don't have strong enterprise architects. So you're going to want a very strong data architect, a very strong business architect, and a very strong integration architect at least, in order to be able to actually form a perspective that's very well thought out and have the architectural patterns for things like ingestion, transformation, and consumption thought about ahead of time. This was probably one of the things that was not that well thought through for us that we ended up going back to later. And that was, keep in mind that actual adoption of the platform includes transition from the stuff you have right now. And building something new and from scratch is perhaps the easier part of that exercise. Transitioning from your current state, which is probably siloed, complex, interconnected through a web of data movement technologies and sandboxes that are not known or by IT, is very, very hard. So one of the things that becomes really important is to be able to connect your data architecture, kind of the rest of your architectural stack. Because as you start to realize that Mart that someone built that you didn't know about has 1,000 little apps running on top of it, and you didn't even know about those apps. And the second you pull one string, something else starts to move as well. So if you don't have a good understanding of your current state and how data architecture actually connects to business architecture and application architecture, and eventually your infrastructure, then it's really difficult to have an elegant perspective as to how to move those Jenga pieces together to actually be able to transition in a cost-effective manner. So that becomes really hard to do. But the other thing that actually comes into play is the business side of things, and that's portfolio and funding. So I think we have a handful of portfolios all with their own money and with their own priorities. And if you keep essentially digging a hole while you're trying to fill a hole, you'll never be able to fill it. So one of the things that we did early on that I thought was pretty successful is we actually partnered with our portfolio management organization, so basically the people who control the money. And we said, okay, this is the target state. We're going to look at the projects that are coming through every week, and anything that should go towards a target state, we're going to have a framework for dealing with those investments. So either it needs to wait, or it needs to be plugged in, or there needs to be some other transitional architecture in play. Because otherwise you can never stop the bleeding, and it makes it really, really hard later on to transition. So the framework that we chose for making those decisions was primarily focused on finances. So essentially what we try to do is we try to measure how much your solution is going to cost, how much business value you're going to get out of it, and what is the amount of sunk cost that you would incur if you were not to use the target state. We try to make it all about the money because, again, if your framework is not agnostic and it cannot be applied consistently, it makes it very difficult to make those decisions in the heat of the moment. So your actual architecture governance process, at least in this space, has to connect to your portfolio management process. So again, I know we're not even talking about the platform yet, but these are the things that we ran into as challenges that we felt were very important, because otherwise you're talking about an investment, but you cannot talk about the business value overall because you're running both things at the same time. So if your organization is anything like ours, you probably have something like an EDW and things that go along with the EDW. You may have some legacy marts, some sandboxes, things like that. And now you're building a brand new platform to essentially plug in to that ecosystem. So if you don't have a way of talking about how you're going to turn stuff off, then you're just increasing the cost, which is the opposite of the objective we're trying to achieve. Change management is also an important focus. So I don't know if you guys know this, but IT is not good at change management. We're just not. So, and that's okay, I'm good at other things. So what you need to do is get someone who is. So as you start to talk about getting access to people to data, giving them access to capabilities that you're building, you need to have someone who understands how to actually do that in a structured way, and who understands change management as a practice, not just as something you do just because it comes with every project. And the business process impact, but by the way, both IT and the actual traditional business units. So even in IT, you'll be making a lot of changes as to how work is getting done. And if you don't have a change management process for IT, it actually makes it very hard as well. This one we learned the hard way. So I kind of wrote, plan to pay up for the sins of the past. So it's not just about a big data platform. right? Your data platform overall, your capabilities will be a combination of all your data management capabilities, your BI capabilities, et cetera. So if you don't have a good metadata management practice, it's going to be even more of a problem now. If you don't have a good MDM practice, it's going to be even more of a problem now. So you have to make plans for accounting for those capabilities in your architecture. So one thing that we learned that was challenging was reference data management. So we have reference data stuck all over different marts, all over the place. People just kind of made a table. Here they track state codes. Here they track something else. Here they track commissions that they pay to agents. They put it in their sandbox in their mart, and then they connected it to like 1,000 things. So it's not anything we even thought about. We were thinking, hey, we ingest data, we build solutions, we build analytics on top of that data, but we did not do a good assessment of reference data management and metadata management. We have like 4 metadata solutions, none of which are actually used. So it's a problem. The more data you have, the more important it is to have metadata. So you're going to have to get those capabilities up to snuff. Otherwise, your platform will just become a mess with all the same problems and then some that your current state has. Not just about technology. Arguably, it's least about technology, in my opinion. So you're not going to have the skills to do this probably in-house. You're going to have to pick a partner. My 5 cents is pick a niche partner who does just this and nothing else. Because you're going to want someone who's done this enough times. And in this space, there's just not that many people who've done this many times. So you want to pick a niche vendor. But at the same time, one of the things I wish we'd done earlier is reach out to your HR partners and start the conversation right away around how you're going to build up the skills of your own team. So the training in this space is still kind of immature. So vendors themselves provide a lot of training in classroom, but there's not a lot of third parties that specialize in this still. And ultimately, your teams are going to need hands-on access in a lab in order to learn. They're going to have to do to learn. So you have to create that ahead of time. And if you need to create new roles in IT, or even in the business for that matter, and those new roles require new HR grades, if any of you have ever tried to do that, you know how long that takes? 6 months to do a job evaluation sometimes. So if you don't start that process early, you don't create the right roles ahead of time, you're going to end up with a data platform that a contractor built for you, and you have absolutely no one to run it or knows how to do it. So again, if that's your model and you want to outsource it, that's fine. But if you actually want to have teams here in your organization who know how to work this platform, you're going to have to train them. And you're going to have to figure out how to retain them, because again, it's a very hot skill. So if you do not have grades that are aligned to this, you're going to be in a situation where they're getting poached perhaps by your competitors. So it's also something to consider. In an industry where our tenure can be 20 years, people who come every 2 years is probably not something we're accustomed to. And since you're going to invest in training them, you want to make sure that they're happy and they stay. So the softer side, the people side of this is something that needs to be considered very carefully, unless you're just planning to put your entire thing in the cloud and not ever have to worry about it again, which certainly is a strategy. The process piece as well. So when you think about the operating model, you may find yourself hoping that your processes were more agile, right? So how long does it take to stand up a database? How long does it take to procure a server? How long does it take to develop something? How long does it take to run a script? Or even the roles of your organization. Who does what? And is Big Data Platform a warehouse? Is it an application? Is it something else? We got really hung up on, when we build this thing, who does what? Who does monitoring, whatever that means, and how do we actually separate those roles and responsibilities? If you have an opportunity to do that early and to bring someone in to help you have advice about how that works, one of the roles that becomes most tricky is DBAs. Like, what's a DBA? And is it different for Hadoop versus infrastructure versus something else? And we think so, but what does that mean in terms of your organizational responsibilities? You'll start spinning on these things that are completely not related to technology if you don't think about them ahead of time. And considering the whole platform. So certainly the big data platform will be the foundation, or is the foundation for us, of our architecture. But chances are you probably need additional things to fill in the gaps, whether it be for data management stuff like MDM or metadata, or some of the newer tools around search and access. So the more data you have, the more tools you need to be able to crunch it efficiently access it efficiently. So it's not just about building the platform itself. It's also about what are the usage patterns that you need to enable for the various users, whether it be data scientists or just analysts or reporting or administrators and so on. And the other thing to consider is kind of the bottom of your stack as well. So what does your directory architecture for security look like? Is it up to date? What about your Unix infrastructure? Is it integrated with things? You may run into things that are just you assumed were fine because it's something you've had for a long time and it's not a new piece of technology. And then you try to plug this into it and you find out, oh my God, like it's 10 years behind schedule. And we haven't updated in a really long time. And it doesn't actually work with what we're doing here. And the versions are out of sync. So consider the bottom of the stack as well. So just a couple quick slides on kind of what we actually ended up doing. So when we completed the data strategy effort, we didn't just focus on the architecture. We had recommendations that kind of span the gamut of, first of all, we wanted to establish a vision for the organization as to what data means to them. Because if it's valuable and it's an asset, then you treat it differently than you would something that's just a commodity of some kind. And so that was part of our governance framework, was establishing guiding principles for how we actually behave as an organization. Operational model was a big part of the recommendations. We had a whole stack of deliverables just around how do we organize ourselves, how do we actually assign roles, who does what, and so on. Governance model I already talked about. It was really important for us to start with that first. And of course, the platform itself. So in the platform itself, we try to enable these 10 capabilities. You can see these are foundational capabilities. So rapid data exchange, sharing data, proactive data quality throughout the supply chain. We kind of catch data quality issues at the very tail end today. We don't know when exactly they occurred in the supply chain. We're not sure how much money they're costing us. So actually having a perspective across the supply chain on data quality was really important. Member 360, a person 360. So we had a big focus on actually master data management as part of that platform. So not only understanding who the member is and who that person is, but actually connecting that to their role as prospect. Perhaps they're also an agent. And mastering things like provider data, agent data, and so on. A really big part of the roadmap for us. Data as a service, data exchange. So again, I mentioned we do tons and tons of partnerships with third parties, whether it be CMS and government or analytics vendors. So it's very important for us to be able to do data feeds in an efficient manner. And then we started to pivot towards an event-driven architecture. So today, a lot of our data comes in once a week, once a day. But we already have opportunity to capture some of that data in an event-driven fashion. So when we can, we started to build for that as well. So you actually see a variety of data ingestion patterns, not just one way. And of course, self-service and reporting. But we purposely chose not to worry about the semantic layer that much. So we have any number of analytical tools, you name it, and visualization tools and things like that. And over time, we hope to be able to build out that architecture to be hopefully everything we need and nothing that we don't. But that wasn't the primary focus. We're really focusing on the data itself, and then later on we can kind of deal with, do you use SaaS or do you use something else? So kind of a busy slide on a reference architecture, if you want to call it that. So you have a variety of data, of actual external and internal sources of data. So we have mainframe sources, we have some event-driven sources, we have some files. And a variety of ingestion mechanisms, whether it be streaming, messaging, file copies, mainframe copybooks, things like that. And then we basically created what you probably would call a data lake, the raw data zone, where everything kind of lands in its native format. We don't do anything to it other than make sure it's readable. And we don't enrich or do anything like that. But we do register the metadata, which is the important first step of the journey. As it starts to move into the data enrichment layer, is when we actually do things like master the data and start to refine it. So in the refined area, we start to apply common business glossary definitions. But we do not yet enrich. We do not yet do anything with it that is for a specific purpose. But we do start to apply some of those data governance things that we all agree to. And the last step of that journey, the for purpose kind of data zone, is what you would typically use a MART for in an EW. So it'd be either relational or big data, depending on the use case. It could be either one. while our raw and refined zones are Hadoop from the Hortonworks distribution. And then you, of course, see the data access layer as well. A really big focus on metadata, profiling, search. So we really wanted to kind of solve a couple problems with this. One is access and transparency to the data, while enabling, of course, security controls to be in place. Which, by the way, if entitlement management security is a challenge for you, it'll be even more of a challenge in this environment. But we also wanted to kind of solve this problem. We have this tribal knowledge. So we have data analysts, 3 of them know membership really well. And if they're not around, it's kind of a problem, right? And they become the bottleneck for all of our solutions. So we wanted to focus on capabilities that actually allow us to expose data transparency to the rest of the organization that needs access to it. And I think at that point, it's the end of our slides, and we have a couple minutes for questions. So any questions? Thank you. Is that a no? All right. Well,